All right, so welcome back. Part two was a pretty difficult episode, I think. I think this episode shouldn't be quite as hard, but I want to start by doing a quick recap of what we got to last time. So what we did was we established a new kind of skeptic, the perceptual justification skeptic, and Pryor developed a new argument for that skeptic. And I just want to recap what the conclusion was. So that skeptic says that you can't be perceptually justified in believing something if you're not antecedently justified beforehand in believing that we're not in a bad skeptical scenario like being deceived or dreaming. So this is directly relevant to the Moore argument. Here's a hand, here's another hand. This new skeptic says, okay, Moore, you show me a hand and you say I should believe that there's a hand there. What's my justification for believing that? Apparently it's my perceptual experience. I see the hand. But this skeptic goes on to say, I'm not justified in believing that there's a hand on the basis of that evidence unless I have a prior antecedent justification to believe that I'm not being deceived by a demon. And furthermore, if I have any justification for believing that I'm not deceived by a demon, that has to be independent of the justification I have for believing that I have hands. So this is the skeptic's way of saying, Moore, you can't just tell me you perceive you have hands and that's your justification for thinking there's no demon. You have to have an antecedent justification to think there's no demon. It can't be the very perceptual experience that you're trying to justify, or that the skeptic would like you to try to justify by proving that there's no demon. So the skeptical principle of justification says that you can only trust your experiential evidence if you have some kind of other justification not based on perception that there's no demon. So that's the recap, and that brings us to Pryor's positive proposal. So if you remember, he's involved in this thing he calls the modest anti-skeptical program, which is, I'm not going to convince the skeptic that they should accept that they have perceptual justification. I just want to be able to convince myself, who am not a radical skeptic, that I have perceptual justification. And what this means in the current case is rejecting two of the skeptic's principles. They're sort of axiomatic views that they won't give up, but that we can give up if we're not radical skeptics like them. The first I've already mentioned is that knowledge requires 100% certainty, and Pryor's way of getting by this is saying anybody who thinks that we know anything on the basis of perception has to be a fallibilist, and so they don't accept that high bar of knowledge, that it requires absolute certainty. So let's get rid of that one, even though the skeptic wouldn't agree. Second is we should reject the skeptic's principle of justification. And this is where the perceptual dogmatism really comes in. He says we should not accept that you can only be justified by your experiences if you have this antecedent, if you can rule out the skeptical bad scenario, if you have some justification for thinking we're not deceived by a demon. So again, Pryor's on the side of Moore. He's saying we can be justified in believing that here's a hand on the basis of our perceptual experience, even though we don't have an antecedent alternative means of ruling out that there's a demon deceiving me. So I can be justified by my experience, even though I'm not justified in ruling out the skeptical hypothesis. So the dogmatist says that when you have a perceptual experience as of a hand or as of a tree, then you're justified in believing that there's a tree or that there's a hand, even in the absence of any antecedent justification for trusting your senses, without having ruled out the skeptical hypothesis. So another way of putting the dogmatism view is that the metaphysical existence of having an experience is intrinsically justifies something. That's a first pass of what it's supposed to be. So like when I was using the Candyland guy, as an example. Part of the point of using that was here you have a character who has an internal sensations. We were imagining that the character had a mental life, and those sensations, those perceptions, are seemingly giving him some kind of evidence that he's in the Licorice Lagoon. And from Pryor's point of view, he really is justified in thinking that he's in the lagoon, even though it's false. So you can have justification for something that's false. So in his case, he's wrong. In our case, we're right, maybe. But even if we are actually being deceived by a demon, Pryor's view is that we're still justified in believing that we have hands. In fact, we're even justified ultimately in thinking that we are not deceived by a demon, but we don't have any antecedent justification for that. In other words, our justification for thinking that we're not deceived by a demon is our perception of the external world and our justification in believing that we have a body and that we're walking around. Okay, so for the rest of this video, I just want to go over, I have this in a couple slides, but basically just go over the things that, sorry, I'm trying to keep a distance from people over here. So for the rest of this video, I just want to go over some elaborations, some added details to what the dogmatist thinks, help add some substance to the view, and then in the last part 4, I'm going to go over the arguments for perceptual dogmatism. So the approach is I want to get clear about what the view is, why it's a response to the skeptic, and then after we know what the view is in the last part, I'll tell you what Pryor's argument for it is. So Pryor furnishes us with 7, I think it's 7 if I counted them all, 7 elaborations or persistifications of the view of perceptual dogmatism. So I'm just going to go over those one at a time. The first one is something I've already been harping on, which is that our perceptual evidence is not indubitable, undoubtable, or infallible. So whatever it is that we get from our experience, it doesn't provide us with a guarantee truth. This is the way in which dogmatism is a kind of fallibilism. So my experience, my perceptual experience, tells me that I'm on the street and that the sun is shining on me and that there's not a cloud in the sky. But, well, maybe there are some clouds. But I could be dreaming. The perceptual experience itself doesn't carry a guarantee that I'm not dreaming or that I'm not misperceiving reality somehow or I'm not being deceived. So it gives us defeasible evidence, defeasible justification. The second point is that even though we're given quote-unquote immediate justification by our experiences, it's not mediated by some background theory or some, it's not mediated by some explanation about why our perceptions are reliable or something like that. It's immediate in that sense. It presents this justification metaphysically, directly. Just having the experience is enough for the justification, but it might not be psychologically immediate. In other words, you might not think it is. It might not be immediately apparent to you that the information or whatever, that the justification is present to you. So it might take some thinking to notice it, or you might even doubt it. You might doubt your own senses. It's not psychologically forced upon you or something like that. It might take some inference as well. So it might be that what I'm justified in thinking on the basis of my experience takes a little bit of thinking. In other words, you might have to think it through. In that sense, it might not be immediate. The third point is kind of it's closely related to the second point, but it's Pryor tries to distinguish his view from like a kind of Cartesian foundationalism. So in Descartes, the sort of foundations have to be self-evident, or they are immediately self-justifying or something like that. And he says the kinds of experiential stuff that we have isn't necessarily like that. So our experiences don't necessarily immediately justify our belief. he spells this out in part by saying that the beliefs that are justified on the basis of perception don't have to be autonomous, as in they don't have to be sort of evidentially disconnected from any other source. So it might take multiple perceptions to come to the conclusion that they support or something like that. You have to have multiple experiences of the same thing to know that it exists over time or something like that. Maybe that's an example. In other words, I view the trees and I continue to view them or something like that, and I gain over time some knowledge about what their nature is. So the perceptions that I have individually contribute to that justified belief about what they are, but they're not autonomous in that they require other perceptions or other reasons to deliver the belief that is justified. Just to keep clear about why this is still kind of perceptual dogmatism, is that the sort of contribution of the justificatory force of the perception doesn't depend on having some other justification for something else. Like, it might take me several different observations to come to a conclusion that's warranted. That's fine with perceptual dogmatism. What the dogmatist is saying is that I can trust my perceptions of things without having this antecedent answer to the skeptic's skeptical scenario challenge. All right, so the next point is that the justification that we get from our senses is defeasible in the sense that it can be defeated by subsequent observations or subsequent experiences. So, like, I can see the tree, and my immediate experience of the tree gives me some justification for believing that it's there. But if I were to go over and try to touch it and it was a hologram or something, my hand goes right through it, that's a new perceptual experience which has undermined my original belief that was justified in the beginning. So it's a general feature of evidence that what you have evidence for now, the beliefs that are supported by your current evidence, those beliefs can be undermined by further evidence later. When you make more observations, your earlier conclusions can become unwarranted. This is a property of a kind of reasoning called inductive reasoning. It's characteristic of all observation in science. Whatever we have scientific reason to believe now, we could, in principle, logically speaking, come to have evidence later that undermines those conclusions. And so what Pryor is saying is perceptual dogmatism is cool with that. It has to accept the fact that our immediate justification is not sort of permanently good. It can be undermined by further evidence, further perceptions or whatever. So the immediate justifications are what he calls prima facie. At least on their face, at face value, they support a thing, but they can be undermined later. The fifth principle is that your total justification for believing something can be both immediate and mediated by something else. So let's just pick, this is kind of a weird example. So I can think that there's a dog in this house or whatever. I hear a dog barking. It's an immediate justification in some sense that there's a dog there on the basis of my perceptual experience, my hearing. The idea that it can be also mediate is, I could have heard from my friend that a dog lived there. So now I have a different justification for believing it. So he says your beliefs can be evidentially overdetermined, meaning multiple sources are sufficient to justify the belief. Let me try and think of another example of this. Well, let's take the case where you make an observation of something which you've read about in a science textbook. You might have learned about the theory of I don't know why this is occurring to me, but like there are these online videos of like people dropping, I think it's mercury onto aluminum, and this weird thing happens. So you could, it like grows like a crystal or something. So you could know that that's going to happen just by knowing the chemistry, knowing the theory that explains what's going to happen, in addition to knowing it by actually doing the observation. Okay, number 6 is the how to put it? Number 6 says that perceptual dogmatism does not entail that being perceptually justified means that you're justified in believing that you're perceptually justified. I talked about the KK principle in a different lecture. This is like the JJ principle. If you're justified, then you're justified in thinking you're justified. Okay. So perceptual dogmatism says just because you're justified doesn't mean that you're justified in believing that you're justified. What is the point of saying that? A big mouthful. Well, roughly you could say something like this. You could be a perceptual dogmatist and say, I have no justification for thinking that I am justified, but I am justified nonetheless. That follows right from dogmatism, because being justified doesn't require having an antecedent justification for believing that you're justified. So perceptual dogmatism involves this rejection of the JJ principle. You're not just you can be justified without being justified in believing you're justified. Let me just elaborate on it a little bit more in a sort of less esoteric way. So if you are a regular old fallibilist, the kind I talked about in the first part of this 4-part series, then you think that our justification for this is a little bit tenuous, but okay, let me try. So if you're the regular old non-dogmatic fallibilist, you think something like our perceptual experiences are reliable in part because of our physiology, the way that our eyes work, the way that light works, the way that the surfaces of objects work. That stuff all contributes to the fact that we're reliable because we're just this kind of physical organism where you open your eyes, the light comes from the magnolia tree? I don't know. And then it enters your retina, and your brain has all this information stored in it. So you're like this information processing machine. And that system allows you to recognize the tree. I can't really recognize it, but someone could recognize it. So that's the explanation of why your perception is justified. It's reliable in that way. A dogmatist, by the way, can accept this as a theory of how our perception works. What makes them a dogmatist is that they think you don't need to have that kind of explanation in order to trust your senses, trust your perceptual experiences. So in that sense, a dogmatist could say, I don't think that we're justified. I mean, I think that they do think that you're justified in this. But anyway, in principle, a dogmatist could say, I don't think that we're justified in believing that we have a brain or eyes or something like that. I just think that we're justified in the immediate perceptual sense. Now, why would a perceptual dogmatist not actually say that? Because like Moore, they think the perceptual dogmatism part gets us knowledge of it gets us to trust that we have perceptual justification for the things we observe. And then that's the basis for doing all kinds of science. So if we're justified in believing we have hands, we're also justified in believing that we have retinas. We're justified in believing that we have brains that are information processing systems, so on, so on, so on. So the dogmatist is kind of like trying to get us justification for believing our scientific theories too, even though we can't rule out the possibility that we're dreaming or that there's a demon. Okay, so this has all been like a sort of roundabout way of trying to explain what the relevance of this rejecting the JJ principle is. I don't know if it was a perfect example, but I can't think of a better one right now. Okay, hi. It's much later now, and I am interjecting with another example or another way of thinking about this case, about the JJ principle. So just think about, I think maybe a good case would be like ancient humans from like 200,000 years ago or something, looking at their hands, like I'm sure they were doing. And so the perceptual dogmatist idea is like they would be justified in believing they have hands, even though those beings, those people don't have sophisticated ideas about justification. They're not thinking about justification. They don't have any justified beliefs about justification. So I think it's plausible to think that the ancient people weren't necessarily justified in thinking that they were justified. They didn't have sophisticated epistemological theories about how justification works or under what conditions they're justified. So they just hadn't thought about it. So then the idea is the JJ principle is false. They were justified in believing all kinds of stuff that they see, that there's a tiger coming, that they're justified in thinking that it's cold out, but they're not justified in believing anything about justification. They don't have any thoughts or theories about that. All right, back to the walk. All right, the last one that he covers, number 7, is, he says, what was it? I'll think of it in a second. Oh, right. Just because you're justified in believing something doesn't mean you're in a position to offer reasons linguistically that justify your experience. Sorry, that convey the justification. So you could have a perceptual experience that justifies you in believing something without being able to articulate what that justification is in words. So immediate justification doesn't mean that you are immediately prepared to explain the source of your justification or defend the view as part of like a dialectic argument with somebody else. Your perceptual experiences can give you justification that's ineffable, that can't be spoken. So the sense in which it's a way of clarifying what is it, what kind of epistemic reasons are we getting, not necessarily the kind that can be spoken or that are translatable into a shared language. So, for example, you could have perceptual evidence that the sky is blue in the sort of immediate phenomenological sense data way that Russell thinks is ineffable. Like, you can coordinate on a color, but you can't necessarily communicate all the information that's in your perceptual experience. And so what Pryor is saying is that perceptual dogmatism doesn't commit you to having the view that says, if you're justified in believing it, then you have to be able to explain it to other people or get it across in a shared language. Okay, I think that's everything I want to cover in this one. So that's just to elaborate on what the perceptual dogmatist is saying. And just to recap one last time, why is perceptual dogmatism relevant? Well, it cuts against the skeptical principle of justification, which says that in order to be justified in believing P on the basis of evidence E, you have to have this antecedent justification for ruling out every Q that's a bad scenario. That principle is incompatible with perceptual dogmatism. So if you're a perceptual dogmatist, then you can rule out the skeptic's principle of justification. Now, I've explained what perceptual dogmatism is, but I haven't given you the arguments for why you should think it's a good view to hold. It hasn't been supported by argumentation yet in this lecture series. It's in the paper, and that's what we're going to cover on the 4th part, 4 of 4, is why you should be a perceptual dogmatist or what the reasons for accepting it are. So, okay.